Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and for a change, to actually be having this meeting in person, as opposed to our past meetings, which were by Zoom. Listening to my good friend Barney Graham talk about original antigenic sin, I think was an appropriate term to use given where we are. But my talk today, I'm going to focus, if I can get my slides, please. I'm going to focus on the challenges and the critical lessons we learned about biological countermeasures in SARS-CoV-2, and what are the lessons that we can take forward to Mpox. I need to disclose that I chair the committee that advises the Director General of the Africa CDC as to whether to declare a pandemic on the continent or not. So I was the one who recommended, my committee recommended the Mpox as a public health emergency, and I also serve as special advisor to the Director General of the WHO. So I'm going to talk about long COVID. I'm going to talk about the benefits of COVID vaccines, some of which have already been covered, so I'll be faster on that. But I'm going to focus on vaccine inequity and its relevance to the challenges we're facing now in the Mpox response. And I'll end off with just one key lesson I'd like for all of us to take away from both HIV and COVID-19 that's applicable to all pandemics. So we usually think about COVID-19 in terms of the acute problem that we faced, the acute illness, the number of deaths that occurred, whether we want to count it as reported deaths or excess deaths. Somewhere between 7 and 28 million people have perished as a result of SARS-CoV-2. But that's what we were dealing with largely in the first 3 years of the pandemic. But now, 4 years later, we're dealing with a different challenge in the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is the challenge of long COVID. Now, most of my patients, when they present, they talk about this brain fog. They can't concentrate, they can't read, they can't watch television. But actually, long COVID is a syndrome of many different illnesses, many different presentations, that cover a very wide range of systems in the body. But central to all of that, the most common challenge is this issue of tiredness. In fact, my medical colleagues tell me they can't even operate now in the evenings and afternoons. They get tired because of long COVID. But there are clear medical implications of long COVID. And here I'm going to talk about just the 3 key challenges we face. So the first is the cardiovascular problems, and that is that what we are seeing now, and most of these data come from Ziad Al-Ali, who's published the most on this subject, that we're seeing a 50% increase in the risk of heart disease. And these focus largely on 3 conditions: stroke, heart attacks, and myocarditis. And it's important to recognize that this increase in cardiovascular conditions occurs even in those who had COVID-19 asymptomatically or mildly. It's not restricted to only those who've had severe COVID-19. And it occurs even if you don't have other risk factors like obesity or sedentary lifestyle or high cholesterol. What we're seeing is a change in the pattern of individuals who are now presenting with these cardiovascular conditions. We've also seen a change in the profile of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is now one of the presenting features that we're seeing because the virus itself attacks the beta cells in the pancreas because of the ACE2 receptors on those cells. And so we're seeing an increase in the presentations of the number of patients with type 2 diabetes. And of course, we're seeing a large amount of new mental health concerns. And they range from anxiety disorders to depression to sleep disorders. And the number of mental health illnesses have increased quite substantially. And this is now being studied in a range of different ways. But one of the studies that really surprised me, in fact, somewhat shocked me, was a study that was published from the UK. So in the UK, they have a long-standing cohort where every 6 months they do brain scans on a cohort of individuals. And in this particular study, what they did was they looked at individuals who had had COVID in between the two scans. So they had a pre-COVID scan and they had a post-COVID scan. And they also do a range of tests on these individuals. And what they found when they compared 400 individuals who had had COVID in that 6-month interval with about 400 who hadn't had matched for age and gender, they found 3 effects which were quite striking. The first was that those who had had COVID had smaller brain size. Now, I know all of you are thinking, but I had COVID-19. Well, it impacts your small and leads to smaller brain size. And what was being seen is a decrease in the amount of gray matter, ranging between 0.5% and 2%. And what they found was those individuals who had the greater losses of gray matter also were less able to complete complex tasks. So there's a physical representation of the physiological changes we are seeing in the brain as a result of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And this is being manifested in many ways. People just don't want to go back to work, for example. If they want to go back to work, they only want to work 2 days a week. And there's a large number of individuals who have dropped out of the marketplace and not trying to do work every single day. So it's manifesting itself in many different ways. I sometimes wonder whether it's manifesting itself in elections in the US and the UK and so on, that's leading to odd results that we would not normally see. Anyway, I joke. To get back to the vaccines themselves, so there are 5 critical benefits of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. And I'll just list them. I won't go into any of the data that demonstrates these effects, but I'll just mention it for now. So the individual effects, there are 4 effects that benefit the individual who takes the vaccine. The first is that there's a decline in the number of asymptomatic infections. So initially, I also thought that when you take the vaccine, that you'll just get a decrease in the number of symptomatic infections. Actually, the original trial of the Pfizer vaccine shows a marked decline, a 66% decline in the number of asymptomatic infections, because we all know that vaccines don't really give you sterilizing immunity, but we were seeing some of those effects initially in SARS-CoV-2. As Barney pointed out, that it's just a matter of timing in relation to when you get the dose of the vaccine. So we see a decrease in asymptomatic infections. We see a decrease in clinically apparent infections. We see a decrease in severe infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. And we see a decrease in the progression to long COVID. And the community benefits we have seen are quite marked in that we see a decrease in the secondary attack rate to close contact. So for individuals who've been vaccinated, they actually are protecting people around them. And there are several studies, but the 2 seminal studies, one in Science and one in the New England Journal of Medicine, show the impact of the vaccinee who does get infected with SARS-CoV-2, the protection that provides to their close contact, whether they are household contacts or people at work. And so we know that many of these 5 benefits vary depending on the type of vaccine, the times since you got your last dose, the variants that's spreading, and whether you were immunosuppressed or not. But regardless, the main effect, and the main effect of most vaccines, is to prevent clinically apparent infection or prevent severe infection and death. And there we see in this modeling study published in the Lancet Infectious Diseases, the size of this effect, which Barney already elaborated on. But from my point of view, what I'm particularly interested in is the effects of the vaccine in protecting against long COVID, because that's the huge challenge we're facing right now. And in this meta-analysis, which looked at 12 studies, which was sufficiently rigorous to look at the effects of vaccines on long COVID, what they showed is 10 of the 12 studies showed significant reductions in long COVID. And if you took any dose of the vaccine, there was a 2 times reduction in your chance of getting long COVID symptoms. If you took 3 doses of the vaccine, you only had 1/6 the risk of developing signs and symptoms of long COVID. So there's a clear benefit, and there's a clear dose response in the benefit of vaccines in preventing and protecting against long COVID. So here we have a situation in that vaccines were not available in certain parts of the world initially for the acute illness, but the net effect is that they also, because they haven't received the vaccine, are not protected from long COVID as well. So here I'm going to just briefly recount the sequence in which countries received vaccines. So the first group of countries that got COVID-19 vaccines were those that developed the vaccines themselves. So that was the US, the UK, Germany, India, China, Russia. And the US, for example, had Operation Warp Speed, and many countries invested in trying to make these vaccines. And so those are the countries that got vaccines first. And on the x-axis that you see there, that's the timeline in which the first set of countries started getting vaccines. The next set of countries that got vaccines were those that got it through advanced market commitments. So these were countries that were rich enough that they could, at risk, they don't even know if the vaccine is even going to work, they were buying the vaccines from multiple different companies, hedging their bets, hoping that one of them would produce an effective vaccine. So they made these commitments and put the money up front. And they could do so in countries that did that with countries like Israel, Denmark, Australia, Canada. Then you had the next set of countries that received vaccines who largely got it as a result of vaccine diplomacy. And here, countries like Russia and China in particular were providing vaccines to a range of different countries that were their allies. The UAE, Turkey, Egypt, for example, were countries that received vaccines as a result of vaccine diplomacy. Then the fourth group of countries, and my own country was one of them, got it through bilateral purchasing agreements. So they waited for the companies to show efficacy of their vaccines, and once that had been shown, they were negotiating purchasing agreements and buying vaccines. And so they got vaccines quite late. And then the last group to get vaccines were those that got it from COVAX. Now, this was the WHO, the world's effort to make vaccine equity and create this mechanism for vaccine equity. But those are the countries that got it last. And those were most of the poor countries and most of the countries in Africa and some in South America. And so we ended up with this kind of situation where there was this maldistribution in vaccines. In fact, very early on, Canada had purchased 9 doses of vaccines for every individual in Canada. And it was a case of just over-purchasing because they just didn't want to take a risk of the companies they were buying from might not have a successful vaccine. So there was this huge challenge that the vaccines were being purchased up front from a few countries that could afford it. And that's what led to this serious challenge that we faced in the COVID-19 pandemic, and probably one of the biggest moral dilemmas that the world faced, in that high-income countries had high vaccination coverage, while low-income countries simply had very poor vaccination coverage. But that got worse, in that what happened is, because of the delay in getting vaccines, what had happened was that the immediacy of the threat had now diminished, and misinformation had now set in. And this kind of misinformation impacted so that even when vaccines did arrive, and arrived late, they were often just simply not taken up. In fact, my own country had to destroy 30 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine because people just didn't want to take it. Not because they weren't vaccinated, because they just didn't want to take the vaccines. And this challenge that we're facing of the delayed supply coming at a time when misinformation was also rampant posed a real problem. And part of this misinformation is this challenge we were dealing with, because I've been dealing with misinformation in the HIV, where people were talking about how the vaccine was made by the US CDC and put into polio doses, and my own president said, you know, HIV doesn't cause AIDS. So I've been dealing with misinformation for a long time. But COVID-19 had an additional dimension in social media. And here, what we were seeing were people who were instant experts. So previously, a real expert would be the dominant voice in the routine media. But in social media, everybody's voice is equal. And I've just used a cartoon here to illustrate this point. For example, Meet Denzel was previously in marketing, but now he has a PhD in epidemiology from the University of WhatsApp. And you got Tandy, who was previously in cosmetics, who now has a master's in microbial genetics from the University of Google. And so everybody is now an instant expert. And you're an instant expert because you are on social media. And this led to the challenge that in social media, not only is every voice equal, but you're dealing with bots that amplify certain voices so that they become the dominant part of the narrative. And so we were dealing with these challenges of a delayed supply and misinformation, and now we're dealing with a new epidemic in Africa, a public health emergency of Mpox. So in Mpox, when we look at the challenge we've been dealing with Mpox, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern in May 2022 and lifted that a bit later, about 10, 11 months later, because the number of cases globally had started diminishing. And during that public health emergency, there were about 100,000 cases, more than 100,000 cases of Mpox in over 50 different countries. But during all of that time, and even when the public health emergency was lifted in 2023 by the WHO, the number of cases of Mpox were actually increasing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what we have seen so far this year is a steady rise in the number of cases in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that manifests itself in Africa. If you look at just this year, I've produced these 3 maps to illustrate how the problem of Mpox is actually growing in Africa. If you look at the period from January to April, 6 countries were affected, and we saw about 5,000 to 6,000 cases. And here I'm quoting all cases that were notified, not only the lab-confirmed cases. And then if you look at January to August, now we were seeing a situation where 13 countries are affected, and we've now got over 23,000 cases. And if you take the most recent data we have till the end of last month, we now have 19 countries affected, and we've got over 50,000 cases. So we now are dealing with a huge challenge with Mpox in Africa. And one of the challenges that has emerged is the development of a new variant. The variant Clade 1b, thought to have emerged in around September of last year, is the dominant variant that we are now concerned. Africa has actually 3 different variants of Mpox spreading in 3 different places. But the one we are most concerned about is Clade 1b, which originates, we think, in South Kivu province in the DRC, and from there has now spread to over 6 countries in Africa and has spread to many countries throughout the world. In fact, I think last week there was a case even in the US of Clade 1b. So Clade 1b is thought to be slightly more contagious, and importantly, Clade 1b is not restricted to children as much as we saw in the previous clades, in that we are seeing in Clade 1b quite a substantial amount of sexual transmission. And we know in Africa from our experience with HIV that when you're dealing with a virus that's spread also through sexual transmission, because of the large number of sex workers that have been impacted by Mpox in South Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're dealing with a challenge that can grow quite rapidly. And the Africa CDC, at our meetings in Addis, we've come up with a plan. We have a clear program of strategy for vaccination. Our initial need is for around 20.5 million doses of vaccine. This is principally to focus on ring vaccination. I mean, ultimately, we're going to need to vaccinate most of the continent to prevent future pandemics, but that's 1 billion or so people. We don't have those doses. So right now, we're concentrating on trying to contain the problem in the critical areas of the DRC and Burundi where the spread is occurring most. But we've only, through donations, have only received 5.6 million doses. And those have already been divvied out to various countries as part of their plan. So we are short. We only have about 1/4 of the doses that we need for our initial vaccine strategy. And so that brings me to my final point, which is the key lesson that I think we can take away from HIV for pandemics, and that's the importance of mutual interdependence and shared responsibility. And here I'd like to quote from a publication by UNAIDS entitled, "How AIDS Changed Everything." And I'd like to quote, "The AIDS movement demonstrates that with a shared vision, shared responsibility, and through global solidarity, we can change the course of history." And indeed we have. Through the Global Fund, the PEPFAR, through wealthy countries making funds available to provide AIDS treatment, we can get AIDS treatment to the most remote village in anywhere in Africa. We've been able to do that. We've been able to save lives because we've shared this vision of ending AIDS as a threat. And that shared responsibility and that global solidarity has captured the essence of this notion that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So we need to get rid of HIV everywhere. But nowhere have I seen this better described and better captured than in this editorial in the New York Times. And I'd like to quote that the pandemic has exposed the paradox that while we are more connected, we are also more divided. To come out of this crisis better, we have to recover the knowledge that as a people, we have a shared destination. The pandemic has reminded us that no one is saved alone. What ties us to one another is what we commonly call solidarity. Solidarity is more than acts of generosity, important as they are. It is the call to embrace the reality that we are bound by the bonds of reciprocity. And here I quote Pope Francis. Thank you very much.